Here's a sentence that should not be possible. A Ukrainian tank crew, outnumbered, operating in a war zone bristling with Russian drones, artillery, and anti-tank missiles, aimed their gun at a Russian infantry fighting vehicle and pulled the trigger. The range? 5,300 meters. That's over 3 miles. You could fit the entire length of Manhattan between that gun barrel and the vehicle. It just turned into scrap metal. The tank that made that shot was designed in Britain, built for a Cold War that never happened. Mocked last year by the head of Russia's biggest defense corporation as, and this is a direct quote, a cooking pot. Russia's top weapons boss publicly called Britain's most advanced tank a kitchen appliance, and then, in the same breath, asked if his engineers could have a look at one. That's the Challenger 2, a tank so British it probably apologized to the Russian IFV after destroying it. The Challenger 2 wasn't born in a hurry. The British don't do things in a hurry. They built an empire over 400 years, invented queuing as a national sport, and spent the better part of the 1980s quietly designing one of the most protected tanks on Earth. It entered service in 1998. Not fast enough for the Americans, not cheap enough for the Germans, and not numerous enough to make anyone genuinely nervous. Only 446 were ever built for the British Army. Compare that to Russia, which has roughly 12,000 tanks in various states of existence, and the math looks grim. But the British never intended this to be a numbers game. They built the Challenger 2 the same way they build everything else, slowly, expensively, and with an infuriating commitment to quality that makes you want to cry when you see the price tag. The armor's called Dorchester. The exact composition is still classified, which means nobody outside of a few very bored engineers in Cheshire actually knows what it's made of. What the public record does show is that in Iraq, the Challenger 2 went through the entire ground war without a single loss to enemy fire. Not one. That's not marketing. That's a data point that made a lot of tank commanders around the world sit up very straight. 71 tons. Let that sit for a second. The Challenger 2 weighs roughly the same as 10 full-grown African elephants, which is a completely useless comparison, but now you'll never forget it. The gun is a 120mm L30A1. It's rifled. The only rifled gun on any Western main battle tank operating today, not smoothbore like the Leopard 2 or the Abrams. Rifled the way every serious sniper rifle is rifled, with spiral grooves cut into the barrel that put spin on the projectile and make it travel in a far more stable, predictable arc. The result is accuracy that borders on the obscene. Ukrainian crews have described engaging targets at distances where other tanks wouldn't even bother looking. The commander with the call sign Hera, who pulled off that 5,300-meter shot, called it a sniper rifle on tracks. That choice comes with a trade-off. The rifled barrel wears out faster under sustained fire, at around 500 rounds versus 1,500 for a smoothbore gun. The special ammunition it needs isn't exactly available at every NATO supply depot. When Britain eventually upgrades the Challenger 2 into the Challenger 3, one of the first changes they're making is switching to a smoothbore gun, mostly so they can share ammo with their allies and stop being the only country at the ammunition buffet with a different plate size. The engine is where things get complicated. 1,200 horsepower sounds like a lot. It is a lot for a car. For a 71-ton tank in a waterlogged Ukrainian field, that's roughly equivalent to asking your grandfather to sprint in a suit of armor. British crews have complained about it since the day the tank entered service. Ukrainian crews complained about it within the first week. One driver, asked by a journalist whether the engine gave him any trouble, said, with the diplomatic restraint of a man who just pulled his tank out of a ditch with another tank, on soft soil it tends to struggle a bit. The crew of 4 sits in a hull that, by modern tank standards, is genuinely comfortable. The fire control is digital. The thermal sights are sharp enough to ruin someone's day at 2 kilometers, and the commander's panoramic view means the crew usually sees the threat before the threat sees them. For a tank that was designed in the late 1980s, the electronics held up better than the engine and the ammunition logistics, and those are the parts that actually matter when someone is trying to kill you. January 2023, the UK made a decision that nobody had made before. Every NATO ally had been watching Ukraine hold off Russia with Soviet-era equipment, improvised adaptations, and sheer bloody-mindedness. The tanks were going to run out before the determination did. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak announced that 14 Challenger 2s would be sent to Ukraine, the first Western main battle tanks committed to the conflict by any country. 14. Not 400, not 40, 14. Germany sent Leopard 2s. The US eventually sent Abrams. The British sent 14 Challenger 2s, a crew of trainers, and the full weight of a press release that described this as a significant contribution to Ukraine's defense. Ukrainian crews flew to Britain, trained for 8 weeks, and returned to Ukraine in late March. The tanks arrived the same day. The 82nd Air Assault Brigade absorbed them into their order of battle, which is a military way of saying 14 tanks were about to do the work of 60. A vehicle designed to stop a Soviet charge across Germany was now sitting on the eastern edge of Europe, doing something its designers never planned for. What happened on the battlefield was interesting, not in the way the press releases suggested. The Challenger 2 wasn't breaking through Russian lines or charging across open ground. It was doing something arguably more valuable. It was sitting in a tree line 5 kilometers from a Russian armored column and making extremely precise holes in things that cost several $1 million each. It wasn't assault, it was long-range attrition from cover. Fire, reposition, fire again, and let the armor absorb whatever came back. Then came Kursk. In August 2024, Ukraine launched a cross-border offensive into Russian territory. The first time a foreign army had pushed into Russian territory in living memory. Challenger 2s were there, not leading the charge, but supporting it, providing the long-range precision fire that allowed Ukrainian infantry to advance into positions Russia had never expected to defend from the inside. One Challenger 2 was destroyed during the Kursk operation, caught by a Lancet loitering munition, one of Russia's most effective tank-killing drones. The crew survived. That last part is not a small detail. On a modern battlefield where drone attacks are relentless and anti-tank missiles are everywhere, getting out of a destroyed tank alive isn't luck, it's armor, and that's the detail that sent Russia's defense chief to a microphone. Sergei Chemezov runs Rostec, which is Russia's state defense conglomerate, the organization responsible for producing the T-90M, the Lancet drone, and essentially anything Russia uses to fight a war. He is not a man given to public uncertainty. He is also, based on everything he said next, a man who is paying very close attention to a tank he publicly claims doesn't matter. Last year, he sat down with the Razvedchik military journal and delivered his verdict on Western tanks. The Leopard 2, he said, had nothing worth copying. The Abrams was interesting, but useless in Russian conditions. And the Challenger 2, a cooking pot. Specifically, a cooking pot unready for real combats. Chemezov then added in the same interview that Russia hadn't managed to capture a Challenger 2 yet, but they'd really quite like to have a look at one. Think about that for a moment. This is the head of Russia's entire defense industry telling a military magazine that Britain's tank is obviously terrible. And also, please, can we have one? That is the behavior of a man who has looked at the 5,300-meter shot, who has seen 2 confirmed losses out of 14 tanks after more than 2 years of war, who knows that most of the original 14 Challenger 2s are still in the fight, and still decided the best move was to call it a kitchen appliance and hope nobody notices the math. The math, for reference, Russia has lost more than 3,000 tanks confirmed by visual evidence since February 2022. And that's the conservative count. Ukraine has lost 2 Challenger 2s. Chemezov's T-90M, his pride, his answer to every Western critic, has lost 137 confirmed vehicles against a tank that he says is a cooking pot. The head of Russia's defense industry has publicly called this tank useless. He has also publicly asked if he can have a look at one. Both statements were made in the same magazine interview. Make of that what you will. Russia hasn't captured a Challenger 2, but they've watched enough of them operate from 3 miles out to have a very clear picture of what they're dealing with. Germany watched the results and felt quietly complicated. The Leopard 2 is a superb tank. Faster, more mobile, better suited to the kind of armored maneuver warfare that NATO's Central European doctrine was built around. It also lost more vehicles in Ukraine than the Challenger 2, partly because it was used more aggressively and in larger numbers, and partly because the Germans sent 60 of them while the British sent 14. The comparison isn't entirely fair. The Leopard 2 crews knew it, the German MOD knew it, and nobody said anything publicly because that's how NATO works. Poland noticed. Poland noticed everything. The Poles are in the process of building the largest land army in Europe, a fact that makes Russia deeply uncomfortable and that Poland is visibly enjoying. And the Challenger 2's performance in the long-range precision role went directly into their planning documents. Poland has been public about building an army for endurance and sustained combat, and watching 14 British tanks hold a front line for 2 years gave that argument a data point. The Americans said what Americans say, which is that the Abrams is better, and they have the economic output to keep saying it regardless of what the battlefield data suggests. The US Army's response to losing Abrams tanks in Ukraine was to begin upgrading the design with unmanned turrets, active protection systems, and hybrid engines, changes directly driven by Ukrainian combat experience. Nobody announced that the lessons came from watching British tanks. It was understood. The Americans did what Americans do when someone else makes a good point first. They improved on it and filed a patent. The British themselves had a more complicated reaction. The Challenger 2 proved the concept. It also exposed the problem. 14 tanks is not a policy. It's a statement. Britain looked at the results, recognized that the platform had validated everything its designers had argued for 30 years, and began the Challenger 3 upgrade program. The gun gets swapped out first, the digital systems follow, and the thermal imaging gets upgraded to something that doesn't belong in a museum. Only 148 will be built. For an island nation that once fielded thousands of tanks and now defends a NATO frontline with a fleet that could be parked in a medium-sized shopping center, this produced the kind of quiet institutional concern that the British call a matter of some debate and everyone else calls a crisis. The lesson from Ukraine wasn't that tanks are obsolete. The lesson was the opposite. Heavy armor, properly used, is exactly what modern warfare still demands. The problem is that Britain learned the lesson and then ordered 148. The British Army, when they designed the Challenger 2, included a built-in boiling vessel inside the crew compartment. It's a standard fitting on British armored vehicles going back decades. Officially, it's for cooking rations. Practically, it's for tea. The British Army gave their main battle tank a built-in kettle. Ukrainian crews discovered this and had a range of reactions. The most diplomatic one was approximately, "We didn't expect this from a tank." When Commander Hera's crew was sitting in a tree line on the Kursk axis, 5 kilometers from a Russian armored column, preparing to make a 3-mile precision shot. It's entirely plausible that someone in that tank had just had a cup of tea. Russia called it a cooking pot. They weren't entirely wrong about the cooking part. The British put the kettle in the tank on purpose. Russian tank crews had a different nickname for their T-72. They called it the lighter, for reasons that should be obvious. One of these cooking metaphors is an insult. The other one describes what happens to T-90s on the Kursk front line. The Challenger 2 is not going anywhere, partly because of battlefield performance, and partly because Britain hired a company called Babcock International to make sure of it. Their job is keeping Ukrainian Challenger 2s alive, which in practice means repairing tanks that Russia thought were finished and putting them back on the line. Ukrainian crews are now trained to do battlefield repairs themselves, which sounds like a logistics footnote until you realize it means a tank that Russia thought it knocked out of the war is back on the front line 3 weeks later. The longer game is the Challenger 3, and Britain is already building it. Back in Ukraine, the remaining Challenger 2s are still on the line, same crews, same front, same patient approach that Russia has spent 2 years trying to answer. The war has changed around them, drones are everywhere, infantry tactics have shifted, and the front line looks nothing like what Britain's designers imagined in 1988. The tank adapted and the crews outpaced it. The digital systems upgrade means it stays competitive against whatever Russia manages to build next, which, given current attrition rates, may take a while. What it will not solve is the weight. 71 tons of steel and classified British engineering will always struggle in Ukrainian mud. That's not a design flaw, it's physics. The crews know it and work around it. They find the good ground. Then they do what the tank was always built to do: outlast everything sent to kill it, which, if you're in the T-90M business, is a deeply inconvenient range. The lesson from Ukraine cuts deeper than any one country's doctrine. It's about a specific idea that the tank designed to survive, shoot accurately from a long way away, and keep its crew alive in the worst possible circumstances is still one of the most valuable things you can put on a battlefield. Russia paid for that lesson in steel. Ukraine still has most of its original 14 Challenger 2s in the fight after more than 2 years of continuous combat. Sergei Chemezov still wants to look at one. Sometimes the cooking pot is the last thing standing.